Welcome to Bookbinding at Home, presented by the Morgan Conservatory. Unfortunately, the Morgan summer classes were canceled this year, so many folks were making books at home. And while bookbinding can involve lots of expensive tools and equipment, you don't need much in the way of tools to make books at home. We've got a few tips today for our at-home bookbinders. Grain direction of paper is a good place to start. The grain of your materials, paper, board, even cloth, should run parallel to the spine in most cases. Determining the grain direction can be easily done by feeling the bounce of the paper. A fold in one direction will give you more resistance, while the other will seem easier to press down. The fold direction with the least resistance reflects the direction the grain is running in your material. In this case, it's running this way. You can fold and cut down large sheets of paper to the size you want. We like to start the crease from the middle and work out to the side. If you don't have this tool right here, a bone folder, which are typically available through any art and craft store, you can use the back of a butter knife or your fingernail or some other kind of hard object that's going to not mar the paper. You can cut this fold with a paper knife or with a dull kitchen knife by inserting it into the fold and drawing it toward you and down the fold of the paper. You can continue this process of folding and cutting down until you get the size that you want and the number of sheets in each gathering that you want. Trimming the text block is easy. Using a couple of rulers and a triangle, you can keep the cuts square to the spine. You'll go through multiple times until you can tear it away. You can do this on every side that needs trimming. Again, a few passes, and your edge is trimmed square. You can utilize the same technique to cut down your bookboard to size. Notice the lines on this bookboard are indicating the grain direction. Once your sections have been folded and trimmed, you can put them between two stiff boards and add a weight. Any kind of weight will do. After your sections have been sitting under weight for a little while, stack them all up, square them up, put some weights on them, and mark where you're going to want your sewing holes. For this book, we're going to be sewing on two supports, or tapes in this case, but there are many different styles of sewing. One way to ensure that you have the exact same punch holes for sewing throughout the text block is to make a jig. This is simply a folded piece of paper where you will mark where each of the sewing stations is. This little paper jig will be used if you are poking your holes through the valley or down through the V of the fold. You can use an awl, as pictured here, or you can simply use a needle, but it should be sharp enough to get through the entire signature while going straight through. Another way to punch your sewing holes is going through the mountain, or an upside down V. You can use some kind of cardboard or any other kind of object that will hold your paper in this manner, so you can press through the marks that you made on the outside of the gatherings. If you wanted to do a supported sewing structure but don't necessarily have a sewing frame, here's a setup that involves little work, little setup time, and is quite cheap to produce. All it is two quick clamps. Here they're fastened to a board, but you could also fasten them directly to a table, a small rod from a coat hanger going through the holes at the end, and some binder clips to hold up the sewing supports. Now we can get to sewing. Some bookbinders like to wax their thread, and it somewhat depends on the type of binding that you're making. This is just standard beeswax, and the thread is drawn through somewhat quickly, and this helps the thread catch through the sewing holes. You can then begin to sew your book in the style of your choosing. Here, we've sewn all along every signature, going over the supports, and on either end there are a couple signatures with a French link stitch to make sure everything is nice and tight. Be sure to bone down your signatures after each one you sew. This will help release excess air and reduce the swell from the sewing. Once you're done sewing your book, it can be removed from your sewing frame. The end sheets for this book were sewn on, and since it's a made end sheet, you cannot see any of the sewing. Now we're going to glue up the spine. If you don't have an actual lying press, use some bricks or some tall books like this to sandwich the text block in place. You can also lay the text block flat and use boards or bricks to hold it in place. The main goal is to have all of the signatures where they're supposed to be once the glue is applied. We're using a mixture of PVA and methyl cellulose. You can use straight PVA, but we find that mixing the two gives you more time to work with the material, and you get a little more slip. When pasting up the spine, work from the inside to the outside so you don't get any glue or adhesive into the pages of the text block. Continue to apply glue until all of the gaps or holes in between the signatures have been filled. At this point, you can also add a spine liner if you choose. This is not a critical step to the book, but it does help strengthen it and make it last longer over time. Now we'll make the case for our book. The dimensions of the case will be determined by the size of your text block. We like to glue up our boards and then apply them to the book cloth. When determining these dimensions, it can be useful to look up case binding how-tos to determine the best size for your book. Once you've laid down your boards, make sure to flip it over and bone down the book cloth on the other side. We'll then trim down the corners of the book cloth. Here we're using a jig, but you can simply snip it off with scissors if you so choose. All you have to do is make sure that the gap between the corner of the board and the edge of the book cloth is enough to cover the corner fully. Next, grab your text block and put it into the case for a dry run. Close the case to make sure that it's going to fit and that you'll know where to place it when you case it in. And now we'll do our turn-ins. Glue up and put down the head and the tail sides first. Be sure to use some waste paper underneath whatever you're gluing out, because it can get messy, but you want your glue to get into every place that it needs to be. Use your bone folder to make sure everything's adhered down and to work the cloth between the joints. You'll then repeat the process for the 4-edge turn-ins by gluing them up, turning them in, and making sure that the corners sit nicely and are covering the bookboard. We'll now attach our text block to the case, a process called casing in. After the text block has been placed into position, we apply adhesive to the outermost page of the text block. Be sure to keep everything in place as you close the case onto the pasted end sheet. And press down. The first side is always trickier than the second side, because once you've done the first side, the book is pretty well in place, but it is crucial to not move anything while you are performing this step. You'll do the other side in exactly the same way, pasting out the end sheet, working from the middle outwards over the end of the sheet onto the waste paper, and folding over the cover and pressing down. As you bone down the end sheets, watch for any excess glue that may come out. You don't want it to get on your book cloth or it may damage it. To further avoid this mishap, we often insert wax paper before we press. This helps protect the text block and the cover from any glue that might ooze out while it's underweight. We once again put it between two stiff boards and add some weight for it to press. You should leave your book under weight from 12 to 24 hours or even longer. Then you can pull it out, remove any wax paper or covering materials, and behold, your beautiful finished book. We hope you learned something from this video. Thank you for supporting us, and happy binding, everybody!